Breaking news. Tonight, a major question is hanging over Washington, Wall Street, and millions of American households. Could the crisis surrounding the Strait of Hormuz become the next big threat to the American economy? Iran is demanding major concessions before the strategic waterway can fully reopen, while negotiations involving Iran and Oman continue. And this is not simply a story about a narrow stretch of water thousands of miles away. Because when energy shipments are disrupted in the Persian Gulf, the consequences can travel all the way to the United States. Gasoline, airfare, shipping, food prices, manufacturing, and potentially, interest rates. The Strait of Hormuz carries a huge share of the world's petroleum and natural gas trade. That means any prolonged disruption can create a shock far beyond the Middle East. So tonight, we're breaking down what is happening, what Iran wants, why Washington is under pressure, and most importantly, what does all of this mean for the average American? Because the next stage of this crisis may not be decided only in military or diplomatic rooms. It could eventually show up at the gas pump, in grocery bills, and inside the broader American economy. What is happening in the Strait of Hormuz? Let's start with the location itself. The Strait of Hormuz sits between Iran and Oman and connects the Persian Gulf with the Gulf of Oman. Geographically, it is relatively narrow. Economically, however, it is enormous. A significant portion of the world's petroleum and liquefied natural gas trade moves through this corridor. Estimates commonly put the share of global petroleum flows at around 1/5. That is why the strait has become one of the world's most important strategic choke points. And in 2026, the situation became dramatically more complicated. Shipping through the area has been heavily disrupted, while governments and shipping companies have been trying to determine which vessels can safely transit. The United States is now facing a difficult balancing act. Washington wants the waterway functioning again. Iran wants concessions. Oman is involved in diplomatic efforts. And shipping companies want one thing above everything else: predictability. Because an oil tanker doesn't need to be physically destroyed for the market to panic. If companies believe that a route is dangerous, expensive, or unpredictable, they can simply avoid it. And when enough companies do that, prices can rise even before an actual shortage reaches American consumers. That is the first important point for Americans to understand. Markets react to risk before consumers see the final result. Iran's demands, why this is so difficult. According to recent reporting, Iran has linked the reopening of Hormuz to several demands involving the United States. Those demands include compensation related to wartime damage, changes involving U.S. military activity in the region, and guarantees concerning future confrontation. That creates an obvious problem for Washington. The United States wants the strait open. Iran wants political and economic concessions. Neither side wants to appear as though it backed down. And that is where negotiations become extremely difficult. Because reopening the strait is not simply a technical shipping decision. It has become part of a much larger argument about power. Who controls the security environment? Who determines which ships can pass? Who pays for the consequences of the conflict? And what guarantees can actually be trusted? Recent reports indicate that Iran and Oman have moved closer to an arrangement concerning shipping through the strait. But that does not necessarily mean the crisis is completely over. A temporary or limited shipping arrangement is very different from a full return to normal commercial traffic. And for American consumers, that distinction matters. Because oil markets don't just ask, "Is the strait technically open?" They ask, "Can ships move through it consistently, safely, and at a predictable cost?" Until the answer is yes, uncertainty remains. The first big impact: gas prices. Now let's bring this home. For most Americans, the most visible consequence of a Hormuz crisis is the price of gasoline. And there is a common misconception here. Some people may say, "America produces a lot of oil. Why should a crisis in the Middle East affect us?" The answer is simple. Oil is traded in a global market. American producers are part of that global market. American consumers are part of that global market. So even if a particular barrel of oil is produced inside the United States, the price can still be influenced by global supply and demand. During the 2026 crisis, U.S. lawmakers and analysts warned that disruptions around Hormuz were already contributing to higher energy costs. One congressional document estimated that average gasoline prices had approached $4.50 per gallon by early May, although gasoline prices can move considerably as global conditions change. And this is where the story becomes important for families. Imagine you're commuting to work. You drive an SUV. You have a long commute. Or you're a small business owner who depends on delivery vehicles. Even a relatively small increase in fuel prices can become a noticeable monthly expense. But gasoline is only the beginning. Why higher oil prices don't stop at the gas station? Oil is not just something Americans put into cars. It is an input into an enormous part of the economy. Transportation depends on energy. Trucking depends on fuel. Airlines depend on fuel. Shipping depends on fuel. Manufacturing depends on energy. And petroleum-based products are used throughout modern industry. So when energy becomes more expensive, businesses have a choice. They can absorb the additional cost. Or they can pass some of it on to consumers. And many businesses eventually have to do the second. That can create what economists call a second-round effect. The first shock is energy. The next shock is transportation. Then logistics. Then production. And eventually, consumers can see higher prices in places that don't appear connected to the Middle East at all. A package delivered to your home doesn't have an Iranian flag on it. A carton of food in a supermarket doesn't say Strait of Hormuz. But the transportation network behind those products is connected to global energy markets. That is why the Hormuz crisis matters. The big question: could this push inflation higher? Now we reach the economic question that Washington is watching closely. Inflation. If energy prices rise sharply and remain elevated, that can put upward pressure on the cost of living. The concern is not necessarily that every product suddenly becomes dramatically more expensive. The concern is that a prolonged energy shock can spread through multiple parts of the economy. And there is another problem. If inflation remains stubbornly high, the Federal Reserve has less room to respond with aggressive interest rate cuts. That matters to Americans with mortgages. It matters to people financing cars. It matters to businesses borrowing money. And it matters to investors. So a geopolitical crisis can create an economic chain reaction. Hormuz disruption, energy uncertainty, higher oil prices, higher transportation costs, inflation pressure, tougher monetary policy decisions. That chain does not happen automatically. There are many factors that can weaken or strengthen the effect. But that is precisely why economists are watching the situation so closely. What about American food prices? Let's talk about groceries. This is another area where Americans could eventually feel the consequences. Food doesn't just cost money because of the ingredients. There is a massive transportation and logistics system behind every supermarket. Farm equipment requires energy. Trucks require fuel. Warehouses require power. Refrigeration requires electricity. Food distribution requires transportation. And companies have to move products across enormous distances. So if energy costs rise and stay elevated, food companies may face higher operating expenses. That doesn't mean a Hormuz crisis automatically causes a grocery price explosion. But it creates another inflationary pressure at exactly the wrong time. For families already dealing with the cost of living, even moderate additional pressure can matter. And that is why this crisis has become much more than a foreign policy story. It is increasingly an economic story. Air travel and shipping. There is another area Americans may notice. Travel. Airlines are highly sensitive to fuel costs. When jet fuel becomes more expensive, airlines have to decide how much of that additional expense they can absorb. Sometimes that can influence ticket prices. Sometimes it can affect routes, schedules, or profitability. And then there is shipping. The modern American economy depends heavily on international supply chains. If ships have to take longer routes, wait for clearance, pay higher insurance costs, or deal with unpredictable conditions, transportation becomes more expensive. And time is money. A container sitting in the wrong location is not just a shipping problem. it can become a business problem. And if enough businesses face the same problem, it becomes an economic problem. This is why financial markets often react to geopolitical developments before the average consumer sees anything different. Investors are trying to predict what happens next. Why the United States is under pressure. So what does Washington actually want? At the most basic level, the United States wants stability. A functioning maritime corridor. Predictable energy markets. And a diplomatic arrangement that does not require Washington to accept terms it considers unacceptable. That creates a difficult equation. If the United States pushes too hard, the risk of escalation can increase. If Washington gives too much, it could face criticism that Iran was rewarded for maintaining pressure on a critical shipping route. And if negotiations drag on, markets can remain nervous. President Trump therefore faces a classic foreign policy dilemma. How do you get the economic result you want without creating a larger conflict? That question is especially important because the economic consequences are not confined to one state. They could affect Americans across the country: California, Texas, Florida, New York, Ohio, Michigan, Arizona. Every state has businesses and consumers connected to national and global energy markets. Could the strait reopen soon? This is where we need to separate confirmed developments from speculation. There are signs of diplomatic progress. Iran and Oman have been involved in discussions over managing maritime traffic. Recent reporting indicates that an arrangement may allow certain commercial shipping movements under specific conditions. But a negotiated arrangement is not the same thing as complete normalization. Shipping companies will want evidence. They will want reliable procedures. They will want security. And they will want insurers to believe that the route is commercially viable. So even if diplomats announce an agreement, the market may take time to fully trust it. That is why the next few days and weeks could be extremely important. Watch the actual movement of commercial vessels. Watch insurance costs. Watch crude oil prices. Watch official statements from Washington, Tehran, and Muscat. And watch whether the number of ships moving through the corridor consistently increases. Those indicators may tell us more than political headlines alone. 3 scenarios for America. So let's look at 3 possible scenarios. Scenario 1, a genuine reopening. If shipping returns toward normal levels and the market becomes confident that the corridor is secure, energy prices could come under downward pressure. That would be the best-case economic outcome for American consumers. Lower fuel pressure. Lower transportation pressure. And potentially less inflationary stress. Scenario 2, a limited reopening. This is more complicated. Some vessels move. Others remain restricted. Rules remain uncertain. Shipping companies continue to price in risk. In that situation, the crisis may become less severe without completely disappearing. Americans could still face elevated energy costs. Scenario 3, negotiations collapse. This is the scenario markets would likely fear most. If diplomatic efforts fail and disruption continues, traders could price in a longer period of supply uncertainty. That could put renewed upward pressure on oil. And if oil rises significantly and stays high, the effects could spread throughout the American economy. Again, these are scenarios, not predictions. Nobody knows exactly which path will happen. What Americans should watch next. So what should Americans watch? Not just the headlines. Watch 5 things. First, gasoline prices. If crude prices rise, consumers may eventually see the effect at the pump. Second, commercial shipping activity. The real test of reopening is whether vessels consistently move through the strait. Third, oil prices. Global crude benchmarks are one of the clearest signals of how markets perceive the crisis. Fourth, inflation data. If energy costs remain elevated, economists will watch whether the impact begins appearing more broadly. And fifth, diplomatic statements. The most important question is whether Iran, Oman, and the United States can create an arrangement that shipping companies actually trust. Because a paper agreement is one thing. A functioning global shipping route is another. Final, what this means for Americans. And that brings us back to the question we started with. Why should Americans care about the Strait of Hormuz? Because in the modern economy, geography does not isolate economic consequences. A crisis in a narrow waterway can influence a global commodity. A global commodity can influence American businesses can influence consumer prices. And consumer prices can influence household budgets. The good news is that diplomatic movement is still possible. Iran and Oman have been working toward arrangements concerning the strait, and Washington remains deeply focused on reopening the route. But the situation remains fragile. The central question is no longer simply whether the strait can reopen. The bigger question is, can it reopen in a way that is stable, predictable, and acceptable to all sides? Because if that happens, one of the biggest economic risks facing global energy markets could begin to ease. But if negotiations fail and disruption continues, Americans may feel the consequences far beyond the Middle East. At the gas pump.in, transportation.in, travel.in, business costs. And potentially in the broader cost of living. For now, the world is watching the Strait of Hormuz, and Washington is watching Tehran. The next move could determine whether this crisis begins to cool, or becomes an even bigger economic story for America. This is a developing situation, and we will continue to follow the latest verified developments. Thanks for watching.